Imagine standing in a forest, looking up at a giant sequoia tree. Its massive trunk stretches skyward, seemingly defying gravity itself. At over 300 feet tall and weighing more than 2,000 tons, it stands as a monument to nature's engineering prowess. You might think this behemoth represents the upper limit of what life on Earth can achieve in terms of mass, a biological ceiling that cannot be surpassed. You would be wrong. What if I told you that the largest living organism on our planet is not something you can easily perceive with your naked eye? That the true titans of our biosphere operate largely unseen, spreading beneath our feet with quiet persistence? That the heaviest living thing on Earth is neither whale nor tree nor anything you might expect? The answer will challenge your understanding of what constitutes an individual organism and force you to reconsider the very boundaries we draw between separate living things. The quest to identify Earth's most massive life form takes us deep into forests, under the soil, and through scientific controversies that continue to this day. Our story begins in eastern Oregon in the late summer of 1998. Forest pathologist Dr. Catherine Evans trudged through the Blue Mountains, her boots crunching over pine needles and fallen branches. She wasn't there as a tourist, but as a scientist investigating a peculiar phenomenon that had been puzzling researchers for years. "Something's killing these trees," she muttered to her research assistant, Paul Zimmerman, gesturing toward a stand of dying conifers. "But it's not acting like any pathogen we've studied before." What Evans and her team observed was a pattern of tree death that seemed synchronized across surprisingly large areas. Healthy-looking trees would suddenly wither and die in expanding circular patches throughout the forest. The culprit appeared to be a humble fungus, Armillaria ostoi, commonly known as the honey mushroom. But there was something unusual happening. Genetic testing of fungal samples collected across nearly 4 square miles revealed something astonishing. What appeared to be many separate fungi was actually a single, connected organism. "The implications are staggering," Evans said during a presentation at the American Mycological Society's annual conference later that year. "We're potentially looking at the largest living organism ever discovered." The scientific community's reaction was mixed. Some researchers were skeptical, questioning whether a fungus spread across miles could truly be considered a single organism. Others were electrified by the possibilities this discovery represented. To understand why this finding was so revolutionary, we need to step back and consider what makes something an organism in the first place. The traditional definition, an individual living thing capable of reacting to stimuli, reproduction, growth, and homeostasis, becomes surprisingly slippery at certain scales. Dr. Thomas Harlan of Stanford University, who specialized in biological classification, explained the conundrum. "Our intuitive understanding of organisms comes from observing animals, particularly mammals. We see clear boundaries, skin, fur, scales that separate one individual from another. But many life forms don't conform to these tidy categories. Plants, fungi, and certain colonial organisms challenge our perception of individuality. A strawberry plant sends out runners that develop into what appear to be separate plants but remain genetically identical and physically connected to the parent. Are these one organism or many? The question becomes even more complex with fungi. Unlike plants and animals, fungi grow as networks of microscopic tubular cells called hyphae, which collectively form the mycelium, the main body of the fungus. What we typically recognize as mushrooms are merely the temporary reproductive structures of this hidden network. Think of mushrooms as just the fruit of the fungus, Evans often told her students. The actual organism lives primarily underground as an interconnected web that can span enormous distances. This understanding set the stage for a radical reassessment of what might constitute Earth's largest organism. If a single fungal network could extend across miles of forest floor, connected through its mycelium, could it outweigh even the mightiest whales and the tallest trees? The search for an answer would lead scientists into unexpected territory and force them to confront fundamental questions about life itself. Where does one organism end and another begin? How do we measure the true extent of living things that largely remain hidden from view? And what does it mean to be a single organism in the first place? As Evans collected more samples from the Blue Mountain site, a new question emerged that would drive the next phase of research. Just how big could these fungal networks grow? and what factors determined their ultimate size. The story of Earth's heaviest organisms takes an unexpected turn when we look beneath the surface, literally. While Evans and her team continued their investigation in Oregon, on the other side of the country, Dr. Marcus Chun was making waves with his research on another potential contender for the title, Populus tremuloides, the quaking aspen. In Utah's Fish Lake National Forest stands what appears to be an ordinary grove of aspen trees covering over 106 acres. Known locally as Pando, Latin for ice spread, this forest looks like thousands of individual trees. However, Chen's genetic analysis revealed something extraordinary. The entire forest was actually one organism, a single male aspen that had been cloning itself for an estimated 80,000 years. Each tree is actually just a stem growing from an interconnected root system. Chen explained during a 2001 TED Talk that would later go viral. Pando is essentially one tree with 47,000 trunks. With an estimated weight of 6,600 tons, Pando dwarfed any individual tree or animal. But was it heavier than the Armillaria fungus in Oregon? And more importantly, how exactly should scientists measure these titans? The question of measurement became a point of heated debate. Some researchers argued that only the living tissue should be counted, excluding heartwood in trees, for instance, which consists of dead cells. Others contended that the entire physical structure constituted the organism, regardless of which cells were currently alive. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a systems ecologist at UC Berkeley, proposed a more nuanced approach. We need to distinguish between biomass, which includes all organic material, and living biomass, which includes only metabolically active tissue. Both measurements tell us different things about these organisms. This distinction proved crucial. While Pando's total biomass was estimated at around 6,600 tons, its living biomass was significantly less, perhaps only 20 to 30% of that figure. The Armillaria fungus in Oregon, meanwhile, was estimated to weigh between 7,500 and 35,000 tons, though the upper range of this estimate was disputed. But the plot thickened further when marine biologists entered the conversation. Dr. Samuel Waters from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography raised an intriguing counterpoint. If we're considering clonal colonies as single organisms, then we need to talk about the Posidonia oceanica seagrass meadow in the Mediterranean. This Mediterranean seagrass forms an underwater meadow stretching over 8 miles and estimated to be between 80,000 and 200,000 years old. Its mass potentially exceeds even that of the Oregon fungus, though precise measurements remain challenging due to its underwater habitat. The debate expanded beyond weight to include questions of age and resilience. How had these organisms survived for tens of thousands of years? What strategies allowed them to persist through climate changes, natural disasters, and human interference? Catherine Evans's team made a breakthrough when they discovered that the Armillaria fungus employs a fascinating survival strategy. When environmental conditions become unfavorable, it can retreat into woody debris and remain dormant for decades, perhaps even centuries, before re-emerging when conditions improve. It's like having a biological backup system, Evans explained. Parts of the organism can die off without killing the whole, and it can regenerate from a tiny fraction of its former self when conditions improve. Similarly, Pando had survived numerous forest fires over millennia because its root system remained protected underground. After each fire, the aspen would simply sprout new stems, essentially regrowing the visible portion of itself. The resilience of these organisms raised profound questions about biological immortality. While individual cells within these giant organisms die and are replaced, the organism as a whole persists potentially indefinitely. These aren't just big organisms, noted Dr. James Morgan, an evolutionary biologist from Cambridge University. They're essentially immortal, barring catastrophic destruction of their entire structure. They challenge our notion that death is an inevitable part of life. The implications of this near immortality extended beyond biology into philosophy. If an organism can replace every cell multiple times over millennia while maintaining its identity, what exactly constitutes the self of that organism? The question parallels philosophical thought experiments like the ship of Theseus, which asks whether an object that has had all its components replaced remains fundamentally the same object. As fascinating as these philosophical questions were, scientists remained focused on the empirical challenge, determining exactly how much these organisms weighed and developing standardized methods for comparison. In 2005, an international conference in Zurich brought together experts from various fields to establish protocols for measuring and comparing large organisms. The resulting Zurich guidelines recommended using dry biomass, organism mass excluding water content, as the standard metric, while acknowledging that different measurements might be appropriate for different research questions. With these guidelines in place, researchers began a more systematic assessment of potential contenders for the heaviest organism title. Beyond Armillaria, Pando, and the Mediterranean seagrass, several other candidates emerged. One surprising contender came from the ocean, a colony of coral in the Great Barrier Reef known as Big Mama, with an estimated mass of over 6,000 tons. Unlike the other candidates, this coral was not clonal but had grown as a single polyp continuously dividing over approximately 4,000 years. Corals represent an interesting case, said Dr. Lucia Fernandez, a marine biologist specializing in coral reef ecosystems. They're colonial organisms composed of thousands of genetically identical polyps, but they grow as a continuous structure rather than spreading underground like fungi or aspens. The definitional questions became increasingly complex. If a coral colony counts as a single organism, what about other colonial creatures like Portuguese man-of-war jellyfish, which consist of specialized, physiologically integrated organisms that cannot survive independently? Even more perplexing were certain bacterial colonies. In 2010, researchers discovered a continuous mat of sulfur-oxidizing bacteria off the coast of Chile covering more than 100 square miles. While its total mass was difficult to estimate precisely, preliminary calculations suggested it might exceed even the largest fungal networks. The bacteria in this mat are not genetically identical like clonal organisms, explained Dr. Richard Thompson, who led the Chilean expedition, but they form a physically continuous structure and operate as a functional unit. Does that make them a single organism? The answer depends entirely on how we define our terms. As researchers delved deeper into these questions, they discovered that the boundaries between individual organisms became increasingly blurred at certain scales and in certain domains of life. The traditional hierarchical classification of organism population community ecosystem began to appear more like a spectrum than a series of distinct categories. This conceptual shift coincided with advances in understanding how information and resources flow through biological systems. New research revealed that fungi like Armillaria don't simply grow outward blindly, but can allocate resources strategically, directing nutrients to areas where they're most needed, behavior reminiscent of decision-making in animals with brains. These networks exhibit a form of distributed intelligence, noted Dr. Patrick Zhang, a researcher specializing in complex systems. They process environmental information and respond adaptively without having anything resembling a central nervous system. Such discoveries suggested that massive organisms like fungal networks might possess forms of cognition entirely alien to human experience, distributed across thousands of square feet rather than centralized in a brain, operating on timescales of decades rather than seconds or minutes. As scientists grappled with these profound questions about the nature of life and individuality, the quest to identify Earth's heaviest organism continued. The next breakthrough would come from an unexpected source and would challenge everything researchers thought they knew about biological mass. In the spring of 2008, a quiet revolution began in a laboratory in British Columbia. Dr. Kevin Reynolds, a forest ecologist who had been studying nutrient cycling in temperate rainforests, made an observation that would transform the search for Earth's heaviest organism. Reynolds had been analyzing soil samples from an ancient forest on Vancouver Island when he noticed something peculiar: DNA sequences that appeared repeatedly across samples taken miles apart. Initially, he assumed this was contamination or an error in his methodology. "I kept getting these identical genetic markers across my entire study site," Reynolds later recalled. "It didn't make sense. Even with wind-dispersed spores, you'd expect more genetic diversity." Intrigued by this anomaly, Reynolds expanded his sampling area and collaborated with geneticist Dr. Amanda Pierce to analyze the mysterious DNA more thoroughly. What they discovered astonished them: a single fungal network of Armillaria solidypes, previously known as Armillaria ostoi, that potentially dwarfed the Oregon specimen. We estimated this network covers approximately 3.7 square miles, Pierce explained during a presentation at the International Mycological Congress in 2010. Based on our calculations of mycelial density and distribution, its mass could exceed 35,000 tons. If confirmed, this would make the Vancouver Island Armillaria the heaviest known organism on Earth by a considerable margin. However, Reynolds and Pierce were careful not to make definitive claims too quickly. Determining the exact boundaries of these fungal networks is incredibly challenging, Reynolds cautioned. We're inferring connectivity based on genetic identity, but physically tracing every connection is virtually impossible. This methodological challenge highlighted a fundamental issue in the quest to identify Earth's heaviest organism: the difficulty of precisely defining and measuring entities that exist largely hidden from view, spread across vast areas, and operate on timescales far exceeding human observation. Dr. Lisa Morgan, an evolutionary biologist not involved in the Vancouver Island research, framed the problem succinctly. We're trying to measure something that challenges our very concept of what constitutes an individual. These organisms don't have the clear boundaries we're accustomed to seeing in animals. The Vancouver Island discovery prompted researchers worldwide to revisit their understanding of fungal networks and other potential megaorganisms. It became clear that previous estimates might have been far too conservative. In Utah, a team led by Dr. Chun returned to Pando with new techniques to more accurately assess its mass. Using ground-penetrating radar to map its root system and LiDAR to create detailed three-dimensional models of its above-ground structure, they revised their estimate upward to approximately 8,000 tons. We've been systematically underestimating the mass of these large clonal organisms, Chun acknowledged. Our new measurements suggest Pando is substantially larger than we thought, though still not as massive as the largest fungal networks. Meanwhile, marine biologists studying the Mediterranean Posidonia seagrass meadow developed new methods to estimate its true extent. Using a combination of genetic sampling, underwater drones, and satellite imagery, they calculated its mass at potentially more than 40,000 tons, making it a serious contender for the title of Earth's heaviest organism. As these revised estimates emerged, the scientific community began to recognize that they were witnessing not just a competition for a biological record but a fundamental shift in how we understand life at its largest scales. Dr. Sarah Williams, a philosopher of science at Oxford University, observed, "What's happening here is not simply the discovery of extremely large organisms. It's a reconceptualization of what constitutes an individual in biological terms. These discoveries are forcing us to recognize that the boundaries we draw between organisms are often more conceptual than physical." This insight led to a breakthrough in the research approach. Rather than focusing exclusively on determining which organism was heaviest, a question complicated by definitional ambiguities and measurement challenges, scientists began exploring what these massive life forms could teach us about biological systems more broadly. In 2012, a landmark paper published in the journal Nature titled "Network Properties of Earth's Largest Organisms" presented a comparative analysis of various megaorganisms, examining not just their size but their structural organization, resource allocation strategies, and resilience mechanisms. The paper, authored by an international team including Evans, Chan, and Reynolds, proposed that these giants represented a convergent evolutionary strategy, different lineages independently evolving similar solutions to the challenges of growing extremely large. What we're seeing in these diverse organisms, from fungal networks to aspen clones to seagrass meadows, are variations on a theme, Evans explained. They've all evolved mechanisms to distribute resources efficiently across vast areas, to respond to local damage without compromising the whole, and to persist through environmental changes that would destroy less resilient organisms. This perspective shifted the conversation from "which is biggest" to "what do these giants have in common, and what can they teach us?" The insights were profound. Researchers discovered that all of these megaorganisms employed some form of modular organization, with semi-independent subunits that could function autonomously if cut off from the whole. This architecture provided extraordinary resilience, allowing them to survive partial destruction that would be fatal to organisms with more centralized systems. It's a completely different paradigm of biological organization than what we see in animals, noted Dr. Robert Fisher, a systems biologist at MIT. Rather than centralizing vital functions like we do with our brains and hearts, these organisms distribute everything. There's no single point of failure. This distributed architecture also allowed for remarkable adaptive capabilities. Studies of the Armillaria networks revealed that they could redirect nutrients and other resources across their network in response to changing conditions, sending support to areas under stress or diverting resources to sections with access to new food sources. It's almost like they have an economy, Fisher observed. Different parts of the network trade resources depending on supply and demand, but without any central authority coordinating the exchanges. These discoveries led to a startling realization. The largest organisms on Earth might also be among the most intelligent, albeit in a form of intelligence radically different from our own. Not the rapid, centralized information processing of animal brains, but a slow, distributed intelligence emerging from countless local interactions across a massive network. Dr. Elena Martinez, a cognitive scientist who had begun collaborating with mycologists, drew parallels to emerging artificial intelligence systems. What we're seeing in these fungal networks has fascinating similarities to how certain AI architectures work, distributed processing units making local decisions that collectively result in complex, adaptive behavior at the system level. This perspective fundamentally transformed how researchers approached these organisms. Rather than viewing them as simple entities that had grown extraordinarily large, scientists began to see them as complex systems with emergent properties that couldn't be understood by studying their parts in isolation. The implications extended far beyond biology. Engineers began studying these natural networks for insights into designing resilient infrastructure systems. Computer scientists found inspiration for new network architectures. Even economists and organizational theorists started examining these biological systems for principles that might apply to human institutions. As this interdisciplinary exploration flourished, researchers continued refining their understanding of Earth's largest organisms. New candidates emerged, including a network of Armillaria gallica in Michigan's Upper Peninsula estimated to be at least 1,500 years old and weighing approximately 21,000 tons. While not the heaviest contender, its unusual circular growth pattern provided new insights into how these fungi expand over centuries. The question of Earth's heaviest organism remained unsettled, with the Vancouver Island Armillaria, the Mediterranean Posidonia seagrass, and several newly discovered fungal networks all being serious contenders. But increasingly, researchers viewed this not as a competition but as an opportunity to understand different evolutionary paths to gigantism. By 2015, scientific consensus had shifted toward recognizing that these various megaorganisms represented different solutions to similar biological challenges, each impressive in its own way. The question was no longer simply which is heaviest, but what can each of these giants teach us about the fundamental principles of life? This shift in perspective opened the door to even more profound insights about the nature of life on Earth and our place within it. As research into Earth's largest organisms progressed, scientists began uncovering implications that extended far beyond academic curiosity. These massive life forms weren't merely biological oddities but represented fundamental aspects of how life functions on our planet. Perhaps most surprising was the discovery of how these giants influence entire ecosystems. Dr. Catherine Evans' continued research in Oregon revealed that the Armillaria fungal network didn't simply exist within the forest. It actively shaped it. We've documented how these networks essentially engineer their environment, Evans explained during a keynote address at the 2016 Ecological Society of America conference. They selectively kill certain trees, creating clearings that alter forest composition. They break down organic matter at varying rates across the landscape, creating patches of differing soil chemistry. They're not just inhabitants of the ecosystem, they're architects. Similar findings emerged from studies of other megaorganisms. Research on Pando showed that the massive aspen clone created microclimates within its boundaries, moderating temperature extremes and altering moisture retention in ways that benefited certain understory species while excluding others. The Mediterranean Posidonia seagrass meadow was discovered to be a keystone habitat, supporting over 1,200 species of marine animals and significantly affecting ocean chemistry across hundreds of square miles. Its vast root system sequestered an estimated 15 million tons of carbon, making it not just an organism but a crucial carbon sink in an era of climate change. This recognition of mega-organisms as ecosystem engineers led to a startling proposition from Dr. James Wilson, an ecologist at the University of Edinburgh. These organisms blur the boundary between individual and ecosystem. At this scale, they don't simply participate in ecological processes, they become ecological processes. Wilson's insight sparked a reconsideration of traditional ecological categories. If an individual organism could function like an ecosystem, with internal cycling of resources and diverse communities of other organisms living within its boundaries, then perhaps the distinction between organism and ecosystem was more fluid than previously thought. This conceptual shift coincided with growing evidence that these massive organisms played crucial roles in the resilience of their broader environments. Studies in areas where ancient fungal networks had been disrupted by development or resource extraction showed decreased recovery rates after disturbances like fires or storms. These giants seem to function as stabilizing forces, noted Dr. Maria Chan, an ecosystem scientist studying forest resilience in the Pacific Northwest. They maintain continuity through disruptions that would otherwise reset ecological succession. They're like the memory of the ecosystem, preserving information and resources through time. The temporal dimension of these organisms proved particularly significant. While most ecological research operates on timescales of months, years, or occasionally decades, these ancient giants experienced their environment on scales of centuries or millennia. Dr. Patrick Zhang explored this perspective in his groundbreaking paper, The Millennial Mind, Cognition at Geological Timescales, proposing that organisms like the 80,000-year-old Pando might perceive and respond to environmental changes invisible to shorter-lived organisms. Consider that Pando has lived through dozens of climate cycles, including the medieval warm period and the Little Ice Age, Zhang wrote. It has adapted to conditions that no human has experienced. Its responses to current climate change may incorporate information from environmental shifts predating human civilization. This long-term perspective made these organisms uniquely valuable as sources of ecological information. Researchers developed techniques to extract environmental data from growth patterns in Pando's oldest roots and from preserved fungal tissues in anaerobic soil pockets, effectively treating these organisms as living environmental archives. Beyond their ecological significance, the study of Earth's largest organisms yielded insights into biological processes that challenged conventional understanding. One surprising discovery came from research on gene expression across the sprawling Armillaria networks. Dr. Amanda Pierce found that different sections of genetically identical fungi could express radically different genetic profiles based on local conditions. What we're seeing is extreme phenotypic plasticity, Pierce explained. Same genes, but completely different expression patterns depending on where in the network you look. It's as if different parts of the organism have specialized, almost like tissues in a multicellular creature, but at the scale of an entire forest. This finding suggested new ways of thinking about biological individuality. If genetically identical cells could differentiate so dramatically across a network, perhaps traditional notions of the individual needed reconceptualization. Dr. Elena Rodriguez proposed what she called the spectrum theory of biological individuality, arguing that what we perceive as distinct categories, cell, tissue, organism, population, community, might better be understood as regions on a continuous spectrum of biological organization. The boundaries we draw between these categories are largely conceptual conveniences, Rodriguez suggested. They help us organize our thinking, but nature doesn't necessarily respect these divisions. These massive organisms show us that the line between individual and collective is far more permeable than we've assumed. This perspective resonated with emerging research in other areas of biology, particularly studies of the human microbiome that were revealing the extent to which our bodies serve as habitats for trillions of microbial cells essential to our functioning. We're all composite beings, noted Dr. Sandra Kim, a microbiome researcher at Johns Hopkins University. These megaorganisms simply make explicit what's true for all life, that individuality is always relational, always embedded in larger systems of exchange and interdependence. The philosophical implications extended even further. If organisms could persist for tens of thousands of years, continuously replacing their component parts while maintaining their identity, what did this suggest about the nature of biological continuity and selfhood? Dr. Thomas Martin, a philosopher of biology, drew connections to Buddhist concepts of impermanence and the ship of Theseus paradox. These organisms embody the paradox of persistent identity amid constant change. No cell in Pando today was present when it began growing 80,000 years ago, yet we consider it the same organism. This challenges our intuitive notion that identity requires material continuity. The economic implications of these discoveries were equally profound. Recognition of the ecological services provided by these ancient giants led to new conservation approaches that valued them not just as curiosities but as critical infrastructure. In 2018, the government of Spain designated the Mediterranean Posidonia meadow as a natural carbon capture facility, allocating resources for its protection equivalent to what might be spent on engineered climate solutions. This represented one of the first cases of natural capital being formally recognized in national accounting systems. Similarly, the discovery of massive fungal networks beneath old-growth forests added a new dimension to debates about forest management and conservation. Beyond the visible trees, these forests harbored invisible networks that had taken thousands of years to develop, networks that couldn't be replaced simply by replanting trees after harvest. Dr. Stephen Miller, a forest economist, calculated that the ecosystem services provided by intact fungal networks could be valued at tens of thousands of dollars per hectare annually when considering their contributions to water filtration, carbon sequestration, and forest resilience. We've been managing forests as if trees were the only valuable component, Miller argued. But these underground networks represent natural infrastructure worth billions in terms of the services they provide. Our economic models need to account for this hidden value. As these economic and philosophical implications unfolded, researchers continued making discoveries about Earth's largest organisms. In 2020, an international team announced the discovery of what might be the most massive living structure yet identified, an interconnected network of Armillaria ostoi in Russia's Siberian taiga, potentially spanning over 15 square miles with an estimated mass exceeding 45,000 tons. While verification of this claim is still ongoing, it highlighted how much remains to be discovered about life's upper limits. More importantly, it reinforced the growing recognition that Earth's true giants operate largely beyond human perception, their vast bodies extending through soil and sea in networks that shape the world in ways we're only beginning to understand. As Dr. Catherine Evans reflected in her 2021 memoir, The Hidden Giants, "When I began studying Armillaria, I thought I was researching a forest pathogen. I never imagined I was actually studying one of the fundamental architects of terrestrial ecosystems, an organism whose life and activities shape entire landscapes over timescales that make human civilization seem momentary." This shift in perspective, from seeing these organisms as curiosities to recognizing them as fundamental ecological forces, represents perhaps the most significant implication of research into Earth's largest living things. It has transformed not just our scientific understanding but our conception of our place within the living world. As our exploration of Earth's heaviest organisms concludes, we return to the question that launched our journey. What is the heaviest living organism on our planet? The answer, like many in science, is both simpler and more complex than it first appeared. Based on current evidence, the heaviest known individual organism is likely the Armillaria ostoi fungal network discovered in Siberia, with an estimated mass exceeding 45,000 tons, roughly equivalent to 7,500 adult African elephants. But this answer comes with important qualifications that reveal deeper truths about the nature of life. Standing in an ancient forest, you might look at the towering trees and think you're seeing the dominant life forms. But this visible landscape is merely the surface expression of something far more vast and intricate. Beneath your feet, fungal networks extend for miles, their microscopic filaments weaving through the soil in complex patterns that have developed over millennia. These hidden giants operate on timescales and spatial scales that make them almost imperceptible to human observation. A single step might carry you across a biological structure that has been growing continuously since human beings first developed agriculture. A handful of soil might contain filaments connected to a network that extends across an entire mountain range. What makes these discoveries so profound is not simply their size, but what they reveal about the interconnected nature of life. These organisms succeed not through dominance but through collaboration, forming symbiotic relationships with trees, creating habitats for countless other species, and facilitating the nutrient cycles that sustain entire ecosystems. Dr. Catherine Evans, reflecting on 2 decades of research, puts it this way: what we've discovered is not just that certain organisms can grow extraordinarily large, but that at the heart of nature's most successful strategies is a kind of distributed existence. Life that transcends the boundaries we typically draw around individuals. This insight challenges us to reconsider our place in the living world. Human beings have often viewed ourselves as the pinnacle of biological evolution, the most complex and advanced organisms on the planet. Yet these ancient giants embody forms of biological organization and intelligence profoundly different from our own but no less sophisticated. While we experience the world through centralized consciousness over decades, these organisms process information across vast networks over millennia. They lack brains yet demonstrate remarkable adaptability. They have no central organs yet coordinate activity across miles. They represent not a lesser form of life but an alternate path of evolutionary development, one that has proven remarkably successful for hundreds of millions of years. Perhaps most importantly, these discoveries remind us of how much remains to be learned about our living planet. The largest organisms on Earth remained effectively invisible to science until the late 20th century. What other biological wonders might still await discovery? What other fundamental aspects of life might we currently overlook simply because they operate beyond the scales we're accustomed to perceiving? As we face unprecedented environmental challenges in the 21st century, the study of these biological giants offers not just scientific insights but wisdom. They have survived ice ages and warming periods, outlasted civilizations, and adapted to conditions we can only imagine. Their strategies of resilience, redundancy, modularity, efficient resource sharing, and collaborative relationships provide models for how complex systems can persist through change. In the end, the search for Earth's heaviest organism reveals something profound about life itself: that it exists not as isolated individuals, but as interconnected processes flowing across space and time, constantly exchanging matter and information in patterns that transcend the boundaries we perceive. The true giants of our planet teach us that life at its most successful is life at its most connected. We walk through ancient forests believing we are visitors in a world of separate beings, never realizing that beneath our feet, between the trees, and throughout the soil exists a biological superorganism that has witnessed the rise and fall of countless species, silently growing, adapting, and persisting through the ages.